before we respond to that.
So let me, thank you very much. Let me begin with a story. I'm a historian, and I think a story will help to frame even the question of a second Reconstruction. So what was the first Reconstruction? The official start of the first Reconstruction was the establishment of presidential Reconstruction in the wake of Lincoln's assassination in 1865.
Can all of you hear?
Okay. The Freedmen's Bureau begins in 1868 as a direct response to the passage of a number of laws that attempted to reinscribe black people into a form of slavery. The criminal justice system was a primary instrument of racial domination, used to basically reinforce the second-class, then citizenship of African Americans, newly empowered by the 13th Amendment. This is all textbook history. Well, by 1868, the Freedmen's Bureau is established to actually open up the South to African Americans. And it is at that moment that we see the proliferation of institution building. 3,000 schools are built, hundreds of churches are built. African Americans gain property rights by virtue of savings in the context of slavery. Many become teachers, judges, ministers, so on and so forth. Well, over the course of about 10 years, violence ensues, the lights dim, Reconstruction is over. But in those moments of possibility, we saw one of the greatest transformations in the political ascent of African Americans. Nearly 1,500 black people served in local, state, and federal offices between the 1870s and the turn of the 20th century in 1901. And by that measure alone, many people declared racism dead in America by the turn of the 20th century. In fact, Plessy versus Ferguson, that we all looking back from the lens of Brown versus Board of Education, for many of us, Plessy versus Ferguson is a racist document. It's a document that articulates the white supremacy of that age. But in fact, in that moment, and this is the key point, in that moment of 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson affirmed the civil rights of black people. That political equality is recognized by the 14th and 15th Amendments, was recognized. What the exception was social equality. What the exception was a recognition that black people, simply by virtue of who they were not equal to whites. In the eyes of the law, they were equal citizens, but in every commonsensical way, they weren't. And if the question is, framed in deep historical terms, where has all the progress gone? Well, one manifestation that occurred then, that is occurring now, is in the minds of the people for challenging the structural barriers that persisted in that day, at the height of Jim Crow, when it began today. So let me tell you a little parable. 30 years after Freedmen's Bureau was established in 1868, 200 plus teachers and preachers from all across the South, many of whom came into the fullness of their inheritance after freedom, precisely because of the Freedmen's Bureau, got together in Hampton, Virginia on July 25th. The 114th anniversary of that day will be Wednesday. The New York Times covered the event, called in the headline, "A Colored Man's Chances." And the whole point of this conference was to strategize, to figure out what do we need to do to forge ahead, and just so that you know I'm not making all of this up. Here's an exact quote. "It is doubtful if there has ever been another such gathering as that just held here, so representative of the best elements of the Negro race, the element that stands individually and collectively for good citizenship and decent living, for education and Christianity, for self-respect developed through self-help, so on and so forth." And they split the conference up, studying everything from health and mortality, tuberculosis, the liquor problem, they called it grog shops then, the alcohols and saloons. They talked about violence in the black community. They divvied up everything so they could study it and move forward. But here's the key thing. If Reconstruction unraveled then, as we know it did, all those black people serving in elective offices were wiped out by the turn of the 20th century. All of those institutions were under attack, direct violence. Part of it was because people assumed that the hard work of challenging white supremacy and state repression and the laws in that day, they just assumed there was no more work to be done. Listen to this quote. "The far-reaching results of the conference were assured in the fact that the audiences included some 200 teachers and preachers from all over Virginia and the neighboring states, from Alabama, Tennessee, and Missouri, from north and south, who will scatter far and wide the results of deliberations and the really valuable collections of the facts." Sounds familiar, right? Sounds like, just like what we're doing here today. But here's the kicker. The aim in regard to each was to find the faults for which the Negro was responsible and to see how to supply the lack or remedy. That was the whole point. The whole point was to figure out what was wrong with black people as the long shadow of Jim Crow crept across the nation. They gathered to figure out what was wrong with black people. Do you hear me? That logic, that articulation of America has cleaned the slate with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in that first Reconstruction period gave birth to a logic of post-racialism that began over 100 years ago. And the laws that were put into place then to circumscribe black people's lives, including convict leasing, including change gains, including secondary education systems, is precisely the system that gave birth to these freedom fighters right here. And yet we were gathering in those places to figure out what was wrong with us that this was happening. So just to make the connection, and I'll stop, Pew did a survey, a 2007 survey, where they asked black people what they thought about the relationship between discrimination in the 21st century and individual responsibility, community responsibility. And as it turns out, older African Americans tended to side with a critique of the structure, a critique that there were still barriers in American life and society that prevented people from living up to their true potential. But young people, more than half blame themselves, blame a lack of responsibility as the reason for every single gap that you're going to talk about over the next 3 days. The aim in regards was to find the fault for which the Negro was responsible. It is a gospel of victim blaming that is as ripe and real today in 2012 as it was in 1898 when all those people got together to figure out what was wrong with black